So you want to know more about Dallin H. Oaks, the next president and prophet of the Church in Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. At some point in the next few days, perhaps by the time you are watching this video, the LDS Church will have restructured its first presidency following the death of Russell M. Nelson, and Dallin H. Oaks, the longest-serving member of the Quorum of the 12, will become the next prophet. By the way, if you haven't seen it yet, you can go back and watch my Russell M. Nelson video where I talk about his presidential tenure and what I believe some of the lasting legacies are going to be considered in the future. Now, Oaks has been a central figure in the LDS tradition for quite some time. You could make the argument that he is one of the most consequential apostles among the LDS hierarchy in the last 50 years for a number of reasons that I'm going to get into in this video. And while a LDS president's past does not always directly dictate how they govern as LDS president, we have examples of the past of someone who acts one way and has one dominant message before being elevated to the presidency and then changing afterward. I think it is fair to say that the past will shape much of how they view the world and their agenda as an LDS prophet. So it makes sense now that we are embarking on the Dallin H. Oaks presidential era, however long it may be, to consider what came before. So in this So You Want to Know More About video, I want to give you a bit of a reading list and a watch list to better understand Oaks's past, to potentially look forward to what's coming in the future. Now, every Friday, I do these So You Want to Know More About X videos in which I give you the background to some of the most important historical works and primary sources, and we walk through them together so that you too can become an expert on this particular topic. And so that's what I'm going to do with Dallin H. Oaks. I'm going to introduce a number of key themes of his life and leadership up till this point, and give you some important texts that you can look at and digest if you want to understand his perspective. Now, I'm going to warn you that I'm going to be brief on all these topics because there's so much I could cover, and I may do future videos on each of these individual topics if there's any interest. And I also want to acknowledge that Oaks sparks a lot of passion from people, especially on LGBTQ issues, where his words and policies in the past have brought a lot of pain to LGBTQ saints. So I want to acknowledge that pain and say I understand it. But the goal of this video is to contextualize Oaks himself. So I am wanting to help viewers understand where Oaks is coming from to hopefully get a sense of where he might be going from here. Let's start with a general biography, the overview of his life story. And there is a biography by a good historian of Oaks. Here it is, In the Hands of the Lord, The Life of Dallin H. Oaks by Richard Turley. However, I want to add a caveat to this biography. While Richard Turley is a great historian, he used to be the assistant church historian for the institution. He was the co-author of 2 of the monumental Mount Meadows Massacre books. This book is written more in Rick Turley's capacity of a church historian than a historian. It is very clearly meant to be faith-promoting and quasi-hagiographic in trying to emphasize Dallin H. Oaks's leadership qualities and emphasizing the hand of the Lord, given the title of the book. It is published by Deseret Book, which is, of course, the church's own imprint. And importantly, and I haven't seen this done with other biographies, it is co-copywritten to both Oaks and Turley. Biographies typically aren't copywritten to the subject. So keep in mind those caveats if you are going to go read that book to understand his history. But there are some benefits to that biography because Turley had access to Dallin H. Oaks's voluminous diaries. And when I say voluminous, Turley says that these are dozens of daily entries. He says that they're the most complete apostolic record since perhaps George Q. Cannon, who also kept voluminous diaries in the 19th century. So there are elements of Oaks' story that you can only get from this biography and not get elsewhere, at least until they give us access to these diaries, which maybe we can dream of one day getting access to those. So a few things of the general background. Again, I'm going to try to be brief, but it's good to have an overall history. Oakes was born in Provo in 1932. Here is a photograph of him playing football for a local high school. He was raised largely with a single mother after his father died when he was only about 8 years old. And his mother seems to be quite a substantial person in her own right. And notably, I'm currently reading the diaries of Carol Lynn Pearson, a wonderful Mormon feminist and activist and poet and theologian. I probably will do a video on her in the future. And she notes that she used to attend the pro-equal rights amendment rallies with Dallin H. Oakes's own mother. So there was a sense of at least some feminist spirit within that home. After receiving a bachelor's degree from BYU, Oakes went to Chicago Law School, one of the best law schools in the nation, where he was editor of the Law Review and graduated cum laude, where he then went to clerk for the Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, one of the most consequential chief justices in American judicial history. But there's an irony there, and that's Oakes will later come to regret the types of judicial activism that Earl Warren represented, and I'll get to more of that later. Eventually, Dallin H. Oakes, after working in private practice, returned to the University of Chicago Law School as a law professor in 1961, worked his way up in administration, all the way to eventually becoming interim dean. Here's a photograph of him from that time being a law professor. And those years at University of Chicago Law School largely shaped much of what came later. I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. Oakes then gets appointed president of Brigham Young University in 1971. Here you see him in the official BYU president outfit, which is, of course, the Cosmo Cougar costume. After a near decade-long tenure at BYU, he was appointed to the Utah Supreme Court in 1981, served for 3 years, where his national stature actually rose. He was rumored to be a Supreme Court justice pick for 2 presidents. He served as chair of the National Broadcasting, the Public Broadcasting Network, PBS. He was the chair of Public Radio, something that he has long championed. And then he became an LDS apostle in 1984. He is also well known for a particular persona, his booming voice and his talks that are known as legal briefs, which were in place since his very beginning of his tenure of his apostolic time. But let's get into some of the key themes and some of the key texts to understand Oakes as an apostle in order to look forward to Oakes as a president. Let's start with his pre-BYU years, meaning the decade that he was at the University of Chicago Law School in the 1960s. You may have seen my previous video in which I argued that the 1960s was the decade that shaped modern Mormonism in the sense that the social justice protests, the civil rights fighting, and all the anti-Vietnam agitation caused a lot of moderate white Americans, especially Mormons in Utah, to move rightward in response to what they saw as social chaos. That can especially be said of Dallin Oakes, even though he's not in Utah, he's in Chicago. But he is shaped in his response to those protests and riots during the 1960s. Let me tell you what I mean. In 1965, Dallin Oakes was part of the broader Mormon intelligentsia. He was connected to the liberals trying to reform the faith and transform the culture through dialogue and discussion. In fact, he was part of the founding editorial board for Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, when it launched in 1965. And I know how crazy it might sound now to associate Dallin Oakes with Dialogue, but it was the case. He was wanting to be part of those conversations. But as that decade moved toward increasing violence and lawlessness in Oakes's mind, he saw that as the corrosion of liberalism and progressivism. And he saw that up close. First, in 1968, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, which resulted in lots of riots and fighting. And he had a front row seat to that, and he denounced that type of lawlessness. And then on campus, Oakes was assigned to chair the committee to oversee all the students being disciplined for their protests, which included hearing the cases of nearly 200 students, including following a 16-day sit-in. Here you see a photograph of the aftermath in which students took over administrative buildings. At 2 moments during these climactic years, by the way, Oakes himself was assaulted by protesting students. And he seems to have been scarred by this entire ordeal. He detested this populist agitation and believed that we need to restore order. And we have his own words making that case in none other than Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, where he participated in a forum on the civil rights protests and the chaos of the 1960s. His essay, here you see the first page, Law and Order, a Two-Way Street. The first words of the essay start out, "Our society is afflicted with a tumorous disrespect for law." And he goes on while detailing the racism that African Americans have faced in this nation and recognizing the systematic injustice and inhumane systems of repression. He argued that a violent response to those activities goes too far, and he denounces civil disobedience. He condemns lawless action, and he bemoans what he calls the respect for law. Now, I'll put a link to this essay and everything else that I'm discussing today in the details for this video. But if you want to see the one essay that really captures a young Dallin H. Oakes that's going to shape the rest of his life, go read that essay in the 1968 dialogue of Law and Order, Our Two-Way Street. Within a couple years, Dallin H. Oakes resigns from the dialogue board as he himself starts moving rightward. So now let's talk about his time at BYU. Now, if you want a good overview of BYU in general, and the Oakes years in particular, I strongly recommend Gary Bergera and Ron Priddis's Brigham Young University, A House of Faith, published by Signature Books a couple of decades ago. That is still a great read, and it has a lot of details about what Oakes did during his presidential tenure. He became president in 1971. Here's a photograph of Oakes and his family. Note how young the family looks, even though Oakes already looks like an old guy with a balding head, something for which I can sympathize with. Now, he was much more open and kind, at least in the eyes of the students, than his predecessor, Ernest Wilkinson, though admittedly that was a very low bar. And he tried to moderate the politics on campus, trying to push away what had been seen as some of the extreme ideas like Cleon Skousen, who was teaching at the time. And in fact, he actually got in hot water with Ezra Taft Benson over the types of speakers who were allowed to address BYU students. And there were some rumors at the time that the reason Dallin H. Oakes stepped down in 1980 was that he had lost the confidence of Ezra Taft Benson, who believed that he wasn't going far enough right in his activities. And importantly, he tried to modernize the BYU. He did notable work to address the gender equity and pay gap. He tried to professionalize a number of the institutes. He increased pay for all faculty. So there was a lot of good that he actually did. But the topic that I'm sure many of you want me to address, what he's really known for at BYU, is what he did with LGBTQ students. Now, it's clear there was a spy ring going on by the police system at BYU that tried to lure out homosexual students so they can be expelled, posing as other homosexual students in newspaper ads and classifieds and things like that. And it's debated how much Dallin Oakes knew about that, although it's clear that they were kind of moving on the priorities that the Oakes presidency was pushing. But more controversially, Oakes was overseeing a research initiative meant to reaffirm and supplement the church's stance on things like homosexuality, which included founding the Institute for Studies in Values and Human Behavior, the Human Behavior Values Institute, that would practice aversion therapies that tried to help people, especially homosexual men, transform and convert into becoming heterosexual. And as part of that broader aversion therapies process, one PhD student, Ford McBride, wrote a dissertation that he finished in 1976 titled Effects of Visual Stimuli in Electric Aversion Therapy, which used pornographic images and shock therapy to induce aversion against homosexual stimuli. The participants in that study were often BYU students who were either confessed to be gay or found out to be gay, and they were given a choice of either going through this therapy and being human guinea pigs or being expelled from the university. Oakes has denied knowing this. In fact, recently he claimed it took place before his presidential tenure, which clearly wasn't the case. It seems quite clear that at least his administration knew this was going on, because they took a great interest in this institute and the work it was doing, because it was going to support the church's stance on these important culture issues. Now, it's important now to give you things to read or watch related to this period. Instead of giving you the words of Dallin H. Oakes, I want to give you the words of the men who suffered from this. First, one of the students who was a subject, John Cameron, wrote a play titled 14, which was a reference to the 14 men who were subjects in the study. I haven't been able to find a copy of that play, though the Salt Lake Tribune refers to it as being powerful. But what we do have access to is a 1996 documentary titled Legacies, which included interviews with, I think, 4 of the men who were involved. And I'll include a YouTube link in the video description and details that you can go and watch yourself. It includes powerful firsthand accounts of what they experienced, even if Dallin H. Oakes still denies its reality. All right, now let's discuss a couple of themes. And you'll excuse me if, as a historian, I want to talk about Dallin H. Oakes' views on history and what he's written and said on the topic, because he has tried to shape how Latter-day Saints approach the past. Now, he himself was a historian, a legal historian. While he was a law professor, he wrote a number of articles on habeas corpus, and then one on Joseph Smith's destruction of Nauvoo, titled The Suppression of the Nauvoo Expositor, published in a law review journal, which argued that while the Nauvoo City Council might have been justified in declaring while the Nauvoo City Council may have been justified in declaring the Nauvoo Expositor libelous, they were not justified in destroying it. Which I think is a useful concession. It doesn't go as far as many scholars do when viewing this, but he approached the topic in a rational and legal manner, and his argument was within the boundaries of acceptable scholarly discourse. And then building on that work, he co-authored with the BYU historian Marvin Hill the book Carthage Conspiracy, The Trial of the Accused Assassins of Joseph Smith, published in 1975 by the University of Illinois Press, and actually won the Mormon History Association's Best Book Award the next year. So the LDS Church now has an LDS prophet who has won the Best Book Award from Mormon History Association, the association over which I'm now the president, which I think is pretty cool. And it's a book that is actually pretty good. It's dated in some ways. It's probably not the best book to read if you want to learn about the topic, but it stands the test of time, and it was especially good for its day. But then, after he gets called to the LDS apostleship in 1984, he follows many of his apostolic brethren in declaring war against many historians. He delivers a number of talks denouncing those who emphasize the secular origins of the faith, who do not emphasize the hand of the Lord in the guidance of the gospel. He delivered one 1987 address in which he declared that not everything that is true is useful, a phrase that Boyd K. Packer used elsewhere. He also, in that address, said it's wrong to criticize the brethren, even if that criticism is true, which got a lot of attention. Then in 1989, and here's an address that I'm going to include as a link in the description, he delivers an address titled Alternate Voices, published in the Church's magazine, in which he argues that Latter-day Saints should not be led astray from these alternate voices who don't have the church's best interests at heart. And it's very clear that he was talking about things like Sunstone and Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, which is ironic how far we've come, right? That Oakes served on the inaugural editorial board for Dialogue, and now he's denouncing it as an alternative voice. And then that verbiage, the alternative voice, and that directive is eventually going to lead directly to the September 6 disciplinary measures in 1993. Now, Oakes has since returned to that theme. In 2007, he participated in a PBS documentary titled The Mormons, in which he was asked about his remarks back in the 1980s. And here's what he said. You're going to see the full block quotes on the screen, and I also have the link to his entire back and forth with the interviewer in the description. This is what he said. I also said something else that has excited people, that it's wrong to criticize leaders of the church even when the criticism is true, because it diminishes their effectiveness as servants of the Lord. One can work to correct them by some other means, but don't go about saying that they misbehaved when they were a youngster or whatever. Well, of course, that sounds like religious censorship also. But not everything that's true is useful. I'm a lawyer, and I hear something from a client. It's true, but I'll be disciplined professionally if I share it because it's part of the attorney-client privilege. There's a husband-wife privilege, there's a priest-penitent privilege, and so on. That's an illustration of the fact that not everything that's true is useful to be shared. Now, as a historian, I chafe at that type of idea, that historians have to be on the side of the church and not share material because it might be destructive to their case. The job of a historian is to dig into the facts and tell the history as it was. By the way, that entire interview for PBS and Mormons is well worth reading. So go to that link and you'll see him talk about a number of topics. And it's notable that Dallin H was the apostolic advisor to the church history department from 1985 to 2000 during a period of intense scrutiny and lack of access to the sources. Now, thankfully, things have gotten a bit better, but that is in the past. But then there's a topic that's the elephant in the room, and that's Dallin H. Oakes' stance on LGBTQ issues. He, more than anyone else, has been at the forefront of helping the church toe the line and avoiding what he sees as the corruption of secular and modern society. And this began from the first few months of his time as an apostle. In 1984, in a memo dated August 7th, he wrote this memo in which he outlined how the church should approach what he calls moral issues, which was largely same-sex marriage. Here you see the first page of this document. It comes from a private collection of archives. Luckily, people have uploaded on the online, so you can read the whole thing at a link in the description. The broader context for this memo and its significance is covered in two excellent books that I recommend: Greg Prince's Gay Rights in the Mormon Church, published by the University of Utah Press, and Taylor Petry's Tabernacles of Clay, published by the University of North Carolina Press, if you want that broader context. So if that represented the church's original stance and their legal opposition to same-sex marriage, it's important to note that he's also authored texts and provided statements to document how the church has changed on these issues. For instance, in 2001, in an interview with the church's newsroom, along with other church authority Lance Wickman, he admitted for the first time in the church that people might be born with homosexual traits, that it's not something just developed. In other words, it might be nature, not nurture, which was a major shift in the LDS perspective of homosexuality, leading them to the current state where they admit people might have a queer identity, but they just shouldn't act on it, and maybe it can be solved at some point in the future. He also reflected a major shift in 2019, when he backtracked on a previous statement in which he was asked about transgender issues and admitted we don't really know yet. He then knew in 2019, where in instructions given to church leaders, and I will have this link in the video details and description, he said this, that the intended meaning of gender, as mentioned in the Family Proclamation and as used in church statements and publications, since that time is biological sex at birth, defining this anti-transgender stance that still dominates the church, laying the foundation for the 2024 policy on transgender members that, again, Dallin H. Oakes' own words, is framing and often shaping and instigating these institutional policies. Now, in this section, I don't want to just focus on Dallin H. Oakes' own words, because I think we also need to hear dissenting voices, and one of those comes from Oakes' own family. Here is Dallin H. Oakes' grandson, Jared Oakes, who identifies as queer, and he currently is the music director for Ballet West, and he's spoken out against his grandfather's homophobic rhetoric. I will link to a Salt Lake Tribune discussion with Oakes in the description. So it's important to remember that just like many church members, Oakes is dealing with this issue within his own family. The last major theme I want to talk about with Dallin Oakes and introduce you to a key text is religious liberty. Dallin Oakes is not just the primary author in the church's institutional stance on homosexuality. He's also the primary author on the church's stance on religious liberty writ large, especially in relation to LGBTQ matters. He had long seen what he denounces as the encroachment on institutional and religious freedom by things like activist judges, which is why it's ironic that he had clerked with Earl Warren, who embodied this type of judicial intervention that has brought social justice to the nation that Oakes now decries. Oakes spoke before Congress, demonstrating how he's become the voice for the church on these topics. He spoke before Congress on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1991 and again the following year. He's long argued, leading other religious figures in pushing back against same-sex marriage and other issues, saying that this is an affront on religious liberty. And then, following Obergefell in 2015, Dallin H. Oakes has symbolized the shift that the LDS Church and many other religious traditions have also taken, saying we are granting gay families and the rights to gender equality and sexual equality, as long as there are carve-outs for religious institutions, right? Pushing forward what he calls the balance between individual liberties and religious freedoms. Now, this type of idea is behind the Utah Compromise in 2015 and then the Respect for Marriage Federal Act in 2022, which Oakes spoke in favor of for both. But the text I want to assign, as if I'm your professor, the text I recommend that if you really want to dig in on where Oakes currently sits on the issue of religious freedom, which I would wager is likely going to be a dominant theme during his presidency, however long it is. In 2021, he delivered an address at the University of Virginia, who have a Mormon studies program, and he was invited to deliver their annual Joseph Smith lecture. And he delivered an address titled, "Going Forward with Religious Freedom and Non-Discrimination." Now, there is a lot of concessions in what, if you're looking at it from a broader historical perspective, a landmark address. He concedes that the gay marriage fight is done, and he even recognizes the pain and inequality that LGBTQ individuals has suffered in America. But, and this is a big but, he argues that in granting the freedom and equality to those people, we need to do so in not taking away the liberties and values of religious institutions like the LDS Church. So if you want to dig in and see what Oakes means by religious freedom, which critics will say that it's the freedom to oppress marginalized groups, but Oakes would say it's a freedom that restores this balance between institutions and individuals, you can go watch or read that link and watch the full address. You can read the whole essay or watch the full address in the link that I provide in the video description. Now, I could cover a lot of other potential themes when looking back to the past of Dallin H. Oakes' tenure as BYU president, law professor, Utah Supreme Court justice, and apostle, and looking forward to what he might do as a president. It's also important to note that presidents may change their tenure once they take on the mantle. Perhaps the most notable example is Ezra Taft Benson, who had a much different presidential tenure than people expected, given his firebrand years as an apostle. It's also important to note that Dallin H. Oakes is 93 years old, I believe. Don't quote, I think 93 years old. At least he's in the 90s. So, and he doesn't seem to be in the greatest health right now, so maybe it's not going to be a long presidential anyway. We don't know. But again, we did not expect Russell M. Nelson to have a vigorous and substantive tenure, which he ended up having. There are other themes that I could bring up about Dallin H. Oakes. I will note one more text, one more reading assignment for all you students that I would recommend. In 2020, he addressed BYU on an address titled Racism and Other Challenges. This was in the wake of the George Floyd protests, in which he used the words Black Lives Matter, which I think shows how far he himself had come in responding to these racial protests. And maybe he is actually more amenable to change and responsive to the broader context than his otherwise legalistic and retrenched mindset might allow. The link to that racism address is in the video description as well. I'm very interested in going forward in the Oakes presidency and seeing this type of balance that he is likely going to try to trod. Because on the one hand, it's clear that he has been a bit of a bogeyman for progressive Latter-day Saints, especially due to his stances and policies and ideas and words on LGBTQ issues that have caused a lot of harm to that community. But at the same time, Oakes has also been denounced by some of the far right in the LDS Church, especially those affiliated with the MAGA world, for his remarks that emphasize the rule of law and stability, and his very clear remarks that denounced the Capitol insurrection in January of 2021. Now, Oakes would see both of those, progressivism, the toxicity of progressivism, but the dangers of the populist right. He would see both of those as a threat to society. Remember, the law and order goes on the two-way street, to go harken all the way back to his dialogue essay from the 1960s. So I'm curious what that's going to look like, of him trying to carve out. He has consciously always tried to present himself as this institutionalist and a moderate. But how does that position work in today's fractured and partisan culture? That's to be determined. But I hope this video was useful. Let me know what you think I got wrong or what I missed in the comments. Let me know if you want me to do videos in the future on any of these particular topics. History has never been more relevant than it is today, because it helps us understand people like Dallin H. Oakes and perhaps guess what's going to come next.